30,000 feet above the Earth. No turbulence, no storm, no warning. Just a quiet Tuesday afternoon flight, cruising somewhere between the clouds and the heavens, carrying 183 souls who had no idea that the man sitting in the cockpit had just noticed something that made his blood run cold. The fuel gauge was dropping. Not slowly, not the way it's supposed to. Fast, too fast. He checked it once. He checked it again. He leaned forward, stared at that dial like it had just said something unforgivable, and in that single silent moment, Captain James Morrow understood that something had gone catastrophically wrong. 183 people, families, children, a honeymooning couple in row 22 who had fallen asleep holding hands, all of them trusting him completely, not knowing, not even suspecting that somewhere beneath the floor of their comfortable aircraft, fuel was bleeding out into the cold, open sky. And in the next 18 minutes, what James Morrow did would shock the entire aviation world. But before we get to those 18 minutes, you need to know who James Morrow was. Because this story isn't just about a plane, it's about a man. And the kind of man he was is exactly why those 183 people got to go home that night. James had been flying for 31 years. He had flown through monsoons over Southeast Asia. He had landed in zero visibility fog in northern Canada. He had handled a bird strike over the Atlantic that took out one engine and brought a full aircraft home without a single injury. Newer pilots whispered his name with reverence. He was 58 years old, 14 months from retirement. His wife Carol had already started circling vacation spots in travel magazines. Portugal, New Zealand, a little coastal village in Italy she'd been dreaming about for 20 years. She'd leave the magazines open on the kitchen table, and James would smile every time he walked past. He had promised her, after 31 years in the sky, he was coming home, for good. They had a daughter, Maya, 26 years old, getting married in the spring. James had written the father of the bride speech 4 times in a leather notebook he kept in his flight bag. The 5th version made him cry. He decided that was the one. That notebook was sitting right behind him in the cockpit when the fuel gauge started dropping. There was a memory James had carried for 3 decades. His first instructor, a gruff, unweathered man named Captain Roy Eldridge, had looked at him on a clear training morning with sharp gray eyes and said, "James, this cockpit is the loneliest place in the world when something goes wrong. Nobody can save you from up here. You have to save yourself, and you have to save everyone behind you. Train until fear becomes a tool. Train until panic becomes a checklist. Because the sky doesn't forgive hesitation." James had repeated those words to himself on difficult flights more times than he could count. He was about to repeat them again. Trans-Aero Flight 271 had departed Montreal at 2:17 in the afternoon, bound for London Heathrow, a standard transatlantic crossing. 8 hours of mostly nothing, the kind of flight experienced travelers do almost on autopilot themselves. But the day had not been entirely smooth from the start. A maintenance check on the hydraulic systems had pushed departure back 47 minutes. A false alarm, but the delay was real. James had walked the cabin during the wait, made a small joke to a family near the front, reassured a visibly anxious young woman in row 9 that everything was fine, and he believed it, because it was. At takeoff, the fuel load was exactly where it needed to be. His co-pilot, 34-year-old Daniel Reyes, sharp, meticulous, annoyingly good at crossword puzzles, had run the fuel calculations and signed off on them. Everything checked out. For the first 2.5 hours, it was the kind of flight that veterans like James find almost meditative. They talked football, Daniel's new apartment, Maya's wedding plans. The comfortable, quiet rhythm of 2 professionals doing a job they knew deeply. Then the weather changed. A slow building pressure system over the North Atlantic that hadn't been anticipated. Air traffic control came through with a reroute, a significant one. Instead of their planned corridor, they were being pushed north, adding considerable distance to the flight. James acknowledged it. Daniel started recalculating. Neither of them said the word forming in the back of both their minds. Fuel. Run the numbers again, James said quietly. Daniel was already doing it. There was a pause, just a breath too long, before he looked up. We're tighter than I'd like. How tight? We'll make it, but there's no cushion. James looked at the fuel gauge. He looked at the new routing. He looked at Daniel. Get me an updated weather read on Heathrow and Shannon. Shannon Airport in Ireland. A common transatlantic alternate. Part of the plan they always had, but almost never needed. The weather came back clean. Both airports fine. Some convective activity mid-Atlantic explaining the reroute. Nothing serious. James nodded. They pressed on. For 20 minutes, everything held. And then the fuel gauge began to move. Not the gradual expected consumption of a long-haul flight. Something different, something wrong. The needle was descending at a rate that didn't match what the engines were burning. James watched it for 60 seconds without speaking, doing the arithmetic in his head, hoping for any explanation that wasn't the one his gut was already screaming at him. Daniel, check the fuel flow on engine 2. Daniel looked at the instruments. His professional mask held, but his eyes told the story. That shouldn't be doing that. No, said James, it shouldn't. A fuel leak. Not catastrophic in the explosive sense. No fire, no rupture. A slow, steady, invisible hemorrhage from the number 2 engine's feed line. A tiny mechanical failure quietly drinking the aircraft dry. And there is no shoulder on the North Atlantic. There is no pulling over. There is only water, cold and dark and unforgiving, as far as every instrument can see. James reached for the radio. Somewhere in row 14, a 7-year-old girl named Sophie was pressing her face against the oval window, watching clouds drift past like enormous slow animals. Her grandmother Ruth slept in the middle seat with a crossword puzzle folded in her lap. Sophie had a stuffed elephant named Gerald and was narrating the flight to him in a whisper, pointing out things of interest. She had no idea what was happening 12 rows forward and 1 locked door away. None of them did. Not the honeymooning couple. Not the nervous young woman in row 9. Elena, 29, flying to Dublin to see her sick father, gripping the armrests the way she always did on flights, talking herself down, grit flying through it the way she always had. They had no idea that the 2 men they had trusted with their lives were staring at instruments delivering a verdict that could not be negotiated with. Montreal Center, Trans-Aero 271. We have a fuel anomaly and are declaring a pan-pan. 1 step below a full emergency. The voice of a man who had trained 31 years to sound exactly that calm in exactly this moment. Trans-Aero 271, confirm pan-pan. State your intentions. James looked at Daniel, who was already scanning charts. At current consumption with the leak factored in, Daniel said carefully, we have approximately 40 to 50 minutes of usable fuel. 40 to 50 minutes. James looked at the map. The nearest airport capable of handling their aircraft was Kinsale Regional on the southern coast of Ireland. 1 runway, designed for small regional aircraft and charters. Its runway length was, charitably, marginal for a fully loaded transatlantic widebody, but it was 22 minutes away, and the math allowed nothing else. Montreal Center, Trans-Aero 271, upgrading to Mayday, confirmed fuel leak, requesting direct routing to Kinsale Regional Ireland. Runway cleared and emergency services on standby. A beat. Trans-Aero 271, Mayday acknowledged. Cleared direct Kinsale. All traffic is being moved. Souls on board? 183, James said. He turned to Daniel, and for just one unguarded moment, something passed across his face. Not panic, not despair, something quieter. The look of a man taking a very deep breath before lifting something extremely heavy. Then it was gone. Start the emergency checklist. Isolate the feed to engine 2. We run on one engine and whatever's left in the main tanks. 38 minutes of fuel remaining. Kinsale was 22 minutes away. That sounds like enough. But every pilot knows that margin is a fiction until the wheels are on the ground. A missed approach, having to pull up and try again, would eat through their remaining fuel in minutes. They had one shot. One. Here is what James knew, and what sat in that cockpit like a quiet, terrible guest. Kinsale Regional's runway was not officially long enough. Not for a wide-body aircraft at near full passenger load. Under normal circumstances, no pilot would consider it. But James had studied a technique, a steep approach profile, precise touchdown at the earliest possible point of runway, maximum deployment of every braking system simultaneously. That could theoretically make it work. Theoretically. It left zero margin for error. 50 feet too late on touchdown and they run out of runway. Too fast and same result. No second chance, no going around, no alternate. This runway, this landing, this moment. And in the back of his mind, Roy Eldridge's voice. The sky doesn't forgive hesitation. James thought about Carol's travel magazines. Portugal, New Zealand, that Italian village. He thought about the leather notebook, the speech, the 5th version, the one that had made him cry. The words he had written for Maya's wedding in the spring. He had never wanted to give that speech more than he did right now. He thought about 183 people who had boarded this morning as part of an ordinary day. Families, strangers, entire universes of unfinished business. And he thought, not today, not on my watch, not one of them. He looked at Daniel, who was watching him with an expression of complete and unwavering trust. "You've got this, Captain," Daniel said quietly. James nodded once, and he began the approach. 12 minutes of fuel remaining. Kinsale Regional appeared through the cockpit window, a small green Irish airfield that looked, from this altitude and speed, impossibly tiny. A thin gray line drawn across a postcard of the Irish countryside. He came in steeper than normal. The aircraft shuddered as the flaps extended, the landing gear dropping with a mechanical thunk that passengers felt through their seats. Daniel was calling out numbers in a steady, quiet rhythm. In the cabin, something had shifted. Flight attendants were in their positions, saying nothing alarming. James had made a short, controlled announcement using the words "precautionary landing" and "minor fuel concern." But passengers could feel something, the way you can feel a change in weather before the clouds arrive. A pressure, a quiet. The Elena in row 9 had been gripping the armrests since the descent began. She closed her eyes and thought about her father, about getting to him. Sophie had stopped narrating to Gerald. She was watching her grandmother, who was awake now, whose face had taken on an expression Sophie didn't fully understand. Ruth reached over and took Sophie's hand. "Is something happening?" Sophie asked. "We're just landing, sweetheart," Ruth said. "That's all. 500 feet. James was entirely inside the controls now. Every breath measured, every correction precise. The crosswind was trying to push the nose right. He held it left with pressure on the rudder he could feel through his whole body. 400 feet. The runway was filling the windscreen. The emergency vehicles were visible. Fire trucks, ambulances, your flashing lights arranged along both sides. And there is perhaps no sight more sobering from a cockpit window than seeing the people positioned there specifically in case you don't make it. James saw them. He said nothing. 300 feet. The engines had gone very quiet. James had reduced power to the minimum he could hold while maintaining control. Every drop of fuel was precious. In the cabin, that quiet had reached the passengers now, and someone near the back began to pray out loud, softly, in a language James couldn't have identified, but that carried clearly in the hush that had fallen over 183 people who had collectively, wordlessly, understood that something real was happening. 200 feet. 100. James held the nose up. Just a fraction. Just enough. Bleeding off the last of the speed, holding the aircraft in that precise, agonizing balance between flying and not flying, stretching every inch of approach until the absolute earliest possible point of runway was underneath them. 50 feet. He let it down. The first contact was soft. Softer than anyone expected. Softer than the situation had any right to produce. A gentle rumble that traveled up through the floor and into the seats and into the spines of 183 people. Then the reversers came on. A roar. A physical force pressing everyone forward against their seatbelts as James deployed everything. Thrust reversers, wheel brakes, speed brakes, throwing it all at the problem of stopping this aircraft on a runway that was running out. The plane shook. It vibrated with a violence that rattled overhead bins and made people cry out. A runway light streaked past the windows in a blur. James held the center line with everything he had, feeling the speed bleed away, fast, then slower still. The end of the runway was visible now. Not comfortable distance. Not the normal, lazy deceleration of a routine landing. The end of the runway was close. The grass beyond the tarmac was visible. The aircraft was still moving. James pressed the brakes harder. Daniel called out the speed. The runway end lights were rushing toward them, and the aircraft was shaking and roaring and slowing. And then it stopped, 37 feet from the end. 37 feet, on a strip of Irish concrete never intended for this aircraft. After a transatlantic crossing that had gone silently, invisibly wrong in every way it could. 37 feet. There was a moment of complete, absolute silence. Not quiet. Silence. The kind that only exists when something enormous has just passed through a room and left everyone standing in its wake, not yet sure they're really still standing. Then Sophie began to cry. Not from fear. The tears arrived before she understood why. They were the tears that come when the body has been holding something impossibly tight and is suddenly, mercifully, allowed to let go. Her grandmother pulled her close without saying a word. And across the cabin, one by one, then in waves, 183 strangers who had not known they were holding their breath began to breathe and cry and reach for the person next to them. Whether they knew them or not, they were alive. In the cockpit, James sat with his hands still on the controls, and Daniel put a hand on his shoulder. Neither spoke. Then the radio crackled. Michael Brennan, the Kinsale approach controller, his professional calm barely containing something that sounded very much like a man exhaling for the first time in 20 minutes. Trans-Aero 271. Confirm stopped on runway. James looked at the runway behind them, at the emergency vehicles already rolling toward them, lights flashing in the gray Irish afternoon. He picked up the radio. Kinsale, Trans-Aero 271. Confirmed. We're stopped. Everyone's okay. He set the radio down. And Captain James Morrow put his face in his hands for exactly 4 seconds. Then he straightened up, took a breath, and began the shutdown checklist. The investigation took 6 months. A microfracture in a fuel line coupling on the number 2 engine, and so small it had passed the pre-departure inspection undetected. Under sustained vibration at cruise altitude, it had slowly widened, letting fuel evaporate invisibly into the engine nacelle. No smell, no visible leak. Nothing to trigger any alarm until the total fuel load had dropped to the point where the discrepancy became undeniable. When investigators examined the aircraft after landing, they found 11 liters of usable fuel remaining. 11 liters. Enough for approximately 3 to 4 additional minutes of flight. James had had 6 minutes of margin when the wheels touched. He had used 5 of them stopping. The official report described the outcome in measured technical language, the kind that regulatory documents require. But everyone who read it understood what the technical language was really saying. It was saying, this should not have ended the way it ended. It was saying, one man. When James came through the cabin door before being taken for debriefing, the applause started before he had taken a second step. Not polite applause. Not the kind convention expects. The kind that comes from somewhere deeper. People were standing who could stand and clapping in their seats who couldn't. And someone near the back shouted something that made everyone around them laugh and then applaud louder. James stood there, jaw set, hands clasped, visibly, genuinely struggling. He nodded, a deep, wordless nod trying to carry everything he couldn't say. One passenger later told a reporter, "He looked like a man trying very hard not to cry in front of everyone, and almost succeeding." He was. Elena called her father from the tarmac before she'd even reached the terminal. He answered on the second ring, and she said nothing for a moment. Just stood there in the Irish wind with the phone against her ear, listening to him breathe. "I'm here, Dad," she finally said. "I'm here." James got home 4 days later. When the car pulled up, Carol was in the doorway. Maya beside her. He made it halfway up the front path. Then Maya came off the doorstep at a run, the way she had when she was 6 years old and he'd come home from long trips. And she hit him like she was still 6, arms around his neck. And James Morrow, 58 years old, 31 years in the sky, completely unflappable, held his daughter in the middle of his front path and fell completely apart. Carol wrapped her arms around both of them and said nothing at all. He gave the speech at Maya's wedding 2 weeks later, the 5th version, the one that had made him cry. He got through almost all of it before his voice broke, which he had predicted exactly, and which made everyone cry anyway, which he had also predicted. Afterward, Carol asked if he was glad it was over, glad to be done with the sky. James looked up. A clear spring evening, deep blue at the horizon fading to violet overhead. A single aircraft crossing the sky in the high distance, a white line forming slowly behind it. He watched it for a moment. "I'll miss it," he said. Then he put his arm around his wife and went inside to dance. Because that is what you do when you've been given back a night like that one. You don't waste a single step. At 30,000 feet, and when the math turned cruel and the runway was too short and the fuel was nearly gone, one man refused to let it end. Not from recklessness, not from bravado, but because 31 years had built in him something that doesn't exist in any aviation manual. Call it will. Call it love for the people behind him. Call it what Roy Eldridge tried to teach a young pilot on a clear morning long ago. That the loneliness of the cockpit when everything goes wrong is not the loneliness of being abandoned. It is the loneliness of being the last line. And James Morrow chose to be exactly that. 183 people went home. That's the whole story. That's enough.